The morning began with quiet sunlight spilling through a half-open window. In a small house just outside Seattle, Ava Reynolds, a 17-year-old high school senior, zipped her travel bag for the first solo trip of her life. It was nothing more than a short flight to Denver to visit her aunt before school resumed an ordinary journey for anyone else. But for her, it was freedom. Her mother had checked her ticket 3 times. Her father had reminded her how to stay calm during takeoff. But Ava wasn't nervous, and she was curious. Planes fascinated her since childhood. She had spent hours watching them cross the clouds from her backyard, always wondering how such massive machines stayed afloat in the sky. A small part of her always wanted to be in that cockpit, not as a pilot, just as someone who understood how flight worked. At the airport, the world was alive with motion. The rolling of suitcases, the echo of boarding announcements, and the deep hum of engines outside. The glass walls, all of it, felt like a living heartbeat. Ava found her gate, Flight 231, bound for Denver. The aircraft stood waiting, a silver blue Boeing 737 reflecting the morning sun. She stared at it for a moment longer than most would, her mind already in the sky. Boarding was routine. A smiling attendant greeted her. A soft breeze of jet fuel and coffee filled the cabin, and passengers shuffled into rows of numbered seats. Ava found hers 18A beside the window. Perfect. She buckled in, pulled out her small camera, and snapped a picture of the wing before takeoff. The kind of thing that would later sit forgotten in her gallery, except this one wouldn't. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calm, confident, familiar. Captain Robert Hale, a veteran pilot with 2 decades of experience, led the flight. His first officer, Linda Tran, was sharp and composed, double-checking every procedure with quiet focus. To them, this was another routine trip, the kind that starts and ends without a single ripple. As the jet taxied down the runway, Ava felt her heart rise with the engines. The sudden thrust pressed her into the seat as the world outside blurred. Concrete turned to clouds, city to sky. She smiled unconsciously. The fear her mother worried about never came. All she felt was awe. At 30,000 feet, the plane leveled out. The seatbelt signs went dark, trays opened, and the cabin settled into quiet comfort. The sound of conversation faded into a background murmur. Ava opened her notebook. She loved to write. Small sketches and words from moments she didn't want to forget. On the page, she wrote, "First time in the sky. Feels like the world stopped below." She didn't know that hours later, that same notebook would be found folded on the seat beside her name tag. In the cockpit, Hale and Linda monitored the instruments. Everything was stable. Outside, the Rocky Mountains spread below like the wrinkles of an ancient face, sharp, endless, and silent. It was a good day to fly, but even good days have unseen cracks. Around 10:37 a.m., Hale began feeling a dull ache behind his eyes. He ignored it, fatigue perhaps. He had flown this route dozens of times. Experience teaches pilots to stay calm through everything. Turbulence, pressure, even discomfort. The ache turned into a tightness in his chest, but he brushed it off. Coffee? Maybe dehydration? He smiled faintly and focused on the radar. Meanwhile, in the cabin, a flight attendant handed Ava a cup of orange juice. She thanked her with a shy nod. Through the small oval window, the sky stretched endless and blue. Somewhere below, faint clouds curled like smoke. She didn't notice the flicker of lightning far in the distance. At 11:02, turbulence hit. Light. Harmless, the kind that rattles cups and makes passengers grip armrests for no reason. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked on. A few nervous laughs, a few glances exchanged. Routine. But in the cockpit, the captain's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the yoke. Linda glanced at him, concerned. He didn't meet her eyes. His breathing grew heavier. 30 seconds later, his hand slipped from the control column. The airplane jolted slightly. Linda reacted instantly. Autopilot on, hands firm. Hale tried to speak, but couldn't. His headset slid sideways as he collapsed against the console. The cockpit alarms came alive. A warning tone echoed, a faint, steady beep like a heart monitor. Linda's pulse surged. Training took over. She hit the emergency transponder, broadcasting a code 7700, the universal distress signal. Controllers on the ground would see it flash red on their screens within seconds. In the cabin, Ava noticed something was wrong. The flight attendants moved faster, eyes toward the front. A passengers, a doctor, hurried up the aisle when one attendant whispered something urgent. The door to the cockpit cracked open briefly. A flash of panic in the glimpse beyond, then it shut. The calm atmosphere shattered into silence. No one screamed. No one yet understood. But the air had changed, heavier, aware. Ava's mind started connecting pieces. She remembered something she once read about autopilot systems, about how pilots could override them in emergencies. Her father had shown her a small flight simulator at home. She remembered the way the artificial horizon moved, the way the altitude indicators blinked when control was lost. She watched the in-flight screen. Altitude, 35,000 feet. Speed, normal. But there was something, a faint change in the tone of the engines, a dip so slight that only someone listening closely could notice. She looked around. Most passengers didn't. Some clutched their armrests, others whispered prayers. Up front, Linda was doing everything she could, stabilizing, calling ATC, trying to wake the captain, her voice steady but breath uneven. The nurse who entered moments later confirmed what she feared. Hale was unconscious, unresponsive, his pulse fading. The co-pilot's hands trembled once, but she couldn't afford fear. Not now. Outside, the sky darkened. The weather front Hale had spotted earlier had grown faster than expected. Lightning flickered. Clouds thickened. They were heading straight into it. Back in seat 18A, Ava closed her notebook. Her instincts, shaped by quiet curiosity and hours spent pretending to fly on a computer screen, were whispering something she didn't understand yet. Something in the air wasn't being controlled the way it should be. She leaned closer to the window, watching as a flash of light split the sky far ahead. The thunder never reached the cabin, but its silence was worse. And somewhere beyond that sealed cockpit door, the fate of everyone on Flight 231 balanced between one woman's trembling hands and a 17-year-old schoolgirl who was beginning to realize she might have to help in ways no one could expect. Down below, the Rocky Mountains were hidden by cloud, invisible but massive. The storm built above them, layers of ice and moisture colliding at supersonic speeds. To the untrained eye, it was just weather. To a pilot, it was a living force. Inside, Linda kept her voice steady as she spoke into the radio, reporting the situation to Denver Center. But she didn't know her words were breaking in and out through interference. Static swallowed half of every sentence. The controllers heard fragments. Captain! Unresponsive. Medical turbulence? Control. And then silence. For a brief stretch of sky, Flight 231 became invisible, not to the eyes, but to communication. Back in the cabin, Ava noticed the sound change again. Not louder, not softer, different. The subtle vibration under her feet had shifted tempo. The plane was climbing slightly, not descending, but unevenly. The engine's pitch fluctuated. To most, it meant nothing. But Ava's instincts, shaped by quiet evenings on her father's simulator, recognized the sound of a manual correction. When a pilot tries to fight crosswinds by hand, she stared at the digital display. Heading 074, speed 422 knots, altitude 30-40-200, a steady, slow loss. The passengers around her began whispering. Someone muttered about the storm. Another clutched their armrest tightly. Ava closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and tried to remember what she had learned from her simulator tutorials. Pitch, roll, trim, balance. She wasn't a pilot. But she understood patterns, and the pattern she saw now wasn't stable. A loud thud shook the cabin, air compression from turbulence, slamming beneath the wings. The aircraft dropped slightly, then steadied. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. The attendants braced themselves, holding onto the seats. The storm had caught up. Outside, the world had turned gray and electric. Rain lashed against the windows in diagonal streaks, lightning flashing just miles away. Each burst of light illuminated the massive wings, flexing, trembling, alive. Ava's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, eyes wide but focused. In the cockpit, Linda's fingers moved fast. The autopilot disengaged again with a metallic click. She cursed under her breath. The static storms were interfering with the control system's sensors. For a moment, the plane was entirely manual, alone in the storm with one unconscious captain and a sky full of chaos. She took a breath and stabilized the yoke. The plane leveled, for now. In the cabin, a faint tremor of calm returned. People began to hope it was just turbulence, but Ava knew better. Something about the rhythm of the flight still felt off, the nose slightly pitched, the engines compensating constantly. It was like the plane was holding its breath, the steady hum that once soothed the passengers of flight. 231 now carried an uneasy pulse, the kind of sound that feels almost normal but isn't, so kind that keeps people silent, sensing something beneath the calm. In seat 18A, Ava Reynolds watched the thin line of clouds outside grow darker, heavier. Lightning flickered again, closer this time, painting the sky in sharp white veins before disappearing into gray. She could feel the faint shift in pressure as the aircraft adjusted altitude. Her ears popped softly, her heart did too. Ava didn't know what had happened in the cockpit, but she could feel it. The aircrew's calm facade was cracking, eyes too focused, smiles too thin. A flight attendant passed her row, checking seatbelts again though no one had asked. Routine didn't look routine anymore. She leaned closer to the window. The plane wasn't descending, but something about the horizon seemed uneven, the faint tilt, so slight no one else noticed. She had seen that once in her simulator game, when the autopilot disengaged and the aircraft tried to correct itself. Her brain whispered what her heart refused to say. Someone up front was fighting for control. In the cockpit, First Officer Linda Tran sat alone behind the glowing instrument panels. The captain lay motionless beside her, pale and still. His headset cord dangled near the throttle, swinging with each small vibration. Linda's hands gripped the controls tightly, adjusting pitch and heading as she toggled between manual and autopilot. The distress code had been sent. Air traffic control knew something was wrong, but that didn't mean help was near. The weather radar painted angry red patches ahead, storm cells shifting fast, unpredictable. She adjusted course 5 degrees south, avoiding the worst of it, but the turbulence was unavoidable. She was flying alone now in a machine built for two. The cabin jolted. Passengers gasped. Overhead bins rattled softly as the plane rode through unstable air. The lights flickered once, just enough to send a chill through the aisle. A woman whispered a prayer, a child clutched a stuffed toy. Fear, quiet and fragile, moved through the rows like static. Ava took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't the kind to panic easily. Curiosity was stronger than fear in her. She watched the in-flight map, the small plane icon crossing a digital sky. The altitude number blinked, 4,500 feet, lower than before. Not much, but enough. The engines roared slightly louder, compensating. The seatbelt sign remained lit. The captain's voice never returned. And yet the aircraft flew on. Minutes passed like hours. The turbulence softened but didn't vanish. The seatbelt lights glowed steady red, constant, unwavering. The attendants moved quietly, collecting cups and reassuring passengers. But the worry behind their practiced smiles couldn't hide anymore. Ava looked at the older man seated beside her. He smiled faintly as if to comfort her, but his eyes betrayed the same question she had. Who's flying this plane now? The thought settled heavy in her mind. She wasn't supposed to know the answer, but somehow she did. Another flash of lightning split the horizon, close enough to bathe the entire cabin in white. The outlines of every passenger froze in that instant, silent silhouettes against the glow. When darkness returned, no one moved for a full second. Then the plane tilted slightly to the right, correcting again. Somewhere above the clouds, invisible to the people inside, Flight 231 was weaving through air currents stronger than steel cables. Every correction, every angle meant survival. And then another jolt, harder. A tray slid off a table. The lights dimmed, flickered, then returned. The engines surged again, louder this time. Ava's heart pounded in sync with the sound. She looked out. Lightning flashed. So close now she could see the electric veins ripple across the sky like living fire. She whispered a silent thought to herself. Something she didn't even fully understand. Stay steady. Hold it. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. Up front, Linda checked her oxygen, her instruments, her failing systems. The storm's static was eating her radio. The last contact she had made with ATC was gone. Alone, she took another breath, trying to remember training from years ago. Fly the plane. Keep control. Don't let the fear fly it for you. The airframe trembled, lightning flashed again, And outside the cockpit glass, clouds became walls. In the cabin, Ava felt the slight drop in her stomach again. Not enough to panic the others, but enough to tell her something was failing. The digital display flickered once, then returned. Her curiosity became focus. She pulled her seatbelt tighter and braced her feet on the floor. The way she'd seen pilots do in simulation videos during turbulence, her breath was calm, almost unnaturally so. Somewhere deep inside, she wasn't just reacting, she was preparing. Because though she didn't know it yet, within the next few minutes, her quiet observation would become something more. The situation would grow worse. The plane would lose more than altitude. And when the call for help finally echoed through the cabin, Ava Reynolds would be the only one who knew what to do. The air around Flight 231 had become alive with tension. Minutes ago, the plane had been sailing smoothly through a serene sky, but now turbulence rattled the cabin with increasing force. Outside, the storm stretched its fingers into the sky, dark clouds swallowing everything in sight. Ava Reynolds couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts not just in the air, but in the very structure of the flight itself. The plane, once steady, now felt like it was fighting to stay afloat. Through the mist of rising panic, Ava kept her focus. Her hands gripped the armrests of her seat, her gaze never leaving the window. The wings were twisting with the wind, flexing with the pressure of unseen forces, and lightning was more frequent now. Each flash illuminated the thick darkness, momentarily turning the sky into a jagged landscape of electric veins. The fear in the cabin was palpable, muffled whispers, shifting seats, uneasy glances, but Ava's calmness stood apart. Her thoughts raced. She had spent years reading aviation books, watching documentaries, and playing flight simulators on her father's old computer. She had never imagined those lessons would prepare her for something like this. But in that moment, as the turbulence shook the plane again, her instincts took over. She knew the plane was descending. Not rapidly, but enough to cause a sense of unease. A look at the in-flight map confirmed it. The altitude readout showed 3,200 feet. A drop subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her heart race with realization. Something was wrong. And then, there was the sound, a slight sputter in the engines. Almost imperceptible, but it was there. The hum of the turbines wavered like a weak pulse. Ava didn't know much about aircraft engines, but she knew this. In a storm this powerful, engines should be louder, more constant. Instead, there was a subtle variation, a fluctuation, like the plane was struggling to stay in control. From her seat, she could see the attendants moving through the cabin with increased urgency. Their faces were tight with worry, but they did their best to mask it. They checked seatbelts, reassured passengers with empty smiles, but Ava could see the truth in their eyes. It was the kind of look she had seen on the faces of pilots in old documentaries, the kind that said everything without a word. A jolt ran through the cabin, followed by a moment of weightlessness and then a heavy drop. The overhead bins creaked as the plane dipped sharply. A woman across the aisle clutched her armrest, eyes wide in fear. The turbulence had grown stronger. Ava swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising anxiety inside her. The seatbelt sign blinked bright red. She didn't feel scared, though. She felt connected. She watched as the plane corrected itself, the wing tipping slightly before righting itself again. She glanced at the monitor in front of her. The speed was still high, the altitude hovering around 33,000 feet. But the pitch of the plane seemed uneven. Ava didn't know much about aviation theory, but something inside her, that quiet instinct, told her that the plane was fighting a losing battle against the storm. The autopilot had disengaged. She could feel it. Up ahead, in the cockpit, Linda Tran was now alone in the battle for control. The captain, Robert Hale, had collapsed hours ago. She had tried to revive him, but there was no response. He was beyond help. She had secured his seatbelt, but it was clear the captain was gone. Linda's hands shook as she adjusted the throttle and rudder. The plane shuddered violently, and the warning lights flashed brighter. The storm outside was closing in. The radar screen displayed a swirling mass of red, showing violent turbulence, gusts of wind that threatened to rip the plane from the sky. She needed help. She needed backup. But her radio was still dead. The static storm had completely cut off communications with air traffic control. She sent out distress signals through every channel available, but there was no response. She was alone. Linda's thoughts raced. She needed to stabilize the plane and buy herself time. She had always prided herself on her cool-headedness, but this was different. There were no training manuals for this, no textbook solutions, no rehearsals for a moment like this. It was a test, pure and simple, one that she wasn't sure she would pass. In the cabin, Ava's eyes moved from the digital display to the flight attendants in the aisle. They moved with practiced calm, but the tension in their movements betrayed the growing concern. A few passengers had begun to whisper in anxious tones. Some were reaching for their phones, even though there was no signal. The storm was too strong for even the most basic communication. Ava's mind raced. She looked around at the worried faces, the tension in the air. Her heart beat louder now, but her thoughts were clear. There was no one in the cockpit but Linda, and Linda was struggling. Ava knew the plane was descending, but it was descending too slowly. It wasn't a controlled descent. It was like the plane was drifting toward the earth with no one at the helm. The seatbelt sign blinked on again as the aircraft shuddered once more. A violent drop followed by another uneasy tilt. The cabin gasped in unison, and Ava knew the moment had arrived. She had to act. Ava stood from her seat, her legs trembling slightly from the jolt of the turbulence. She made her way toward the cockpit door, her hands gripping the aisle as she moved through the disoriented crowd. The flight attendants didn't stop her. They must have known something was wrong. They must have sensed the same growing fear that had taken root in her chest. A moment of silence passed. Then Linda's voice cracked, but grateful. "Get in here now!" And so Ava Reynolds, a schoolgirl with no pilot's license, stepped into the cockpit, ready to take control. The cockpit was chaos, blinking alarms, trembling controls, and the low, haunting tone of altitude warnings filling the air. Outside, lightning split the clouds open like torn fabric, illuminating the aircraft's struggle against the roaring storm. The world beyond the windshield was pure white fire, then black again. Ava Reynolds steadied herself beside the co-pilot's seat. Her heart hammered in her chest. But her expression was calm, too calm for someone her age. First Officer Linda Tran gave her a quick, tense glance before turning back to the yoke. The aircraft lurched again. The nose dipped, the altimeter spun lower. Linda's hands were trembling. The captain's headset dangled uselessly beside his still form. His chest had stopped moving long ago. She had done everything she could. Now there was only the storm, the plane, and survival. Ava leaned forward, her eyes scanning the glowing displays. She had seen enough, flight decks in documentaries, and simulators to recognize what was happening. The autopilot had disengaged, and the aircraft was in manual mode, a pilot's nightmare in this kind of weather. The wind screamed as lightning flashed again, a brilliant fork tearing across the sky. The cabin lights flickered, and the warning sirens grew louder. Linda shouted above the noise, her voice cracking under the pressure of the storm. "We've lost hydraulics on the left aileron." Ava didn't need to understand every system to know that meant one thing. The plane couldn't turn properly. The controls were fighting back, unresponsive. The nose pitched downward. The altimeter ticked past 28,000 feet, then 27,000. Ava's hand found the co-pilot's side stick. It was vibrating violently, almost pulling against her. She looked at Linda, who nodded once. A silent agreement between two people who didn't have time for questions. "Keep it level!" Linda managed to shout, tightening her grip on the yoke. Ava pressed forward with her full strength. The stick resisted, metal grinding under pressure. For a brief second, the plane steadied, the alarms paused, and the world outside aligned into a straight horizon again. But the storm wasn't finished. Another strike of lightning illuminated the clouds, so close it blinded her. The thunder came a second later, deafening, violent. The plane rolled hard to the right. Linda gritted her teeth, pulling back with all her strength. Ava's muscles burned, her hands slipping against the metal. The vibration was relentless, like holding on to the wing of the storm itself. But she refused to let go. Her eyes darted across the cockpit, searching, thinking. She spotted the rudder trim switch. She had seen it before in flight tutorials, when pilots used it to correct uneven turns. She reached for it instinctively, adjusting it a few degrees. The plane leveled, just slightly, but it was enough. Linda looked at her, disbelief flashing through exhaustion. Ava didn't notice. She was focused on the horizon ahead, or what little she could see of it through the storm. "Try frequency 121.5, Ava said softly. Emergency channel. Linda blinked.
How do you...
Try it, Ava insisted. Linda flicked the switch. Static roared through the speakers. Then a faint voice. Flight 231, do you copy? We have your emergency beacon. Linda's head dropped forward in relief. This is Flight 231, she said hoarsely. We have lost the captain, manual control only. Heavy turbulence, requesting vectors to nearest runway. The controller's voice came back, barely audible through the interference. Copy that. You're 20 miles south of Reno. Descend to 20,000. We're clearing airspace for emergency landing. Ava's chest tightened. They had a chance. Linda followed the descent instructions, her hands steady now. Guided by purpose and the faint voice on the radio, Ava adjusted the trim again, correcting a small roll. The plane responded, sluggishly but enough. They were descending through the clouds now, each layer brighter than the last. Lightning still flashed around them, but less frequently. The static faded, the alarms quieted one by one. At 12,000 feet, the clouds began to break apart. And there, below them, was the world again. The lights of Reno glowing like scattered gold across the dark desert. Linda exhaled for the first time in what felt like forever. Her voice was barely a whisper. You did good, Ava. But Ava didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on the runway lights ahead, two glowing lines cutting through the rain-soaked night. The approach was rough. Every gust of wind tested the limits of the aircraft. But Ava and Linda moved together, unspoken coordination, every motion balanced, every correction instinctive. The plane lined up with the runway center line. At 3,000 feet, the engines stabilized. At 1,000 feet, the storm began to break behind them. Ava felt the shift, the calm that comes only after the worst is over. The wheels hit the runway with a heavy thud, water spraying across the tarmac. The plane bounced once, then steadied. Reverse thrust engaged. The sound of roaring engines echoed through the cabin, and then silence. Flight 231 rolled to a stop under the pale lights of the runway. The world outside was wet, gleaming, and utterly still. Inside, passengers broke into tears and applause. Linda sat back, her breath shaking, and turned to Ava, the schoolgirl who had become her co-pilot. The storm outside faded into memory, replaced by the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ava simply looked forward, at the horizon, at the faint glow of dawn breaking through the thinning clouds. The girl who once looked out airplane windows and dreamed of flying had just saved 187 lives.